What was I trying to trick you with?
Your hair.
Oh.
Baffling. Strange quail.
My hats are dirty. I normally wear hats when it's cold, but my hats are dirty, so it's like I'll just wear this. Yeah, it's because like beanies, I can't have my hair in a ponytail. You know? So like it covers my ears when my hair is down. And so but hats, I still like put my hair over my ears so I can have it in a ponytail still. Or like a braid, you know, like
Not away from the break. I'm told they have horrible temperament, but they're very cute.
gosh, she's cute. I like our 126 sauce. Where can you buy it? Yeah, there's yeah, I liked it. I was like, oh, this isn't too bad. But we'll see. My roommate said that those tests are like very direct and like straight. Not like straight up and to the point. Like he definitely doesn't try to trick us.
What's 126? What class?
CMI is fundamentals of immunology.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's a nice class.
Yeah. There, I have to say that for 20 years, there was no undergraduate immunology class on this campus.
Really?
And I remember when I got to med school, I thought,
There should be.
there should have been an immunology class.
Yeah, I'm actually taking two, and then there's like a hybrid PMI 129, and it's like a world immunology, like One Health type of
Oh,
immunology.
yes, global health, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, they're both cool classes so far. One day, instruction.
Yep.
Oh my god, I'm on the communications wait list. So, yeah, I'm on the communications, but I'm 7, and I don't know if she's gonna have anyone, so I emailed her and I'm like, wait, where do you go back? But I'm just gonna take nutrition, if not. I don't wanna take your food, dude. I looked at the food, and since it's all online, it's like just 3 T's or different. I don't care. You know, I'd rather go to nutrition than T's or so. And I was looking at stuff
That's a good sign.
like from like last.
Yeah, we're speaking to the death.
10 or someone. Yeah. Oh yeah, she's really busy.
2, 4, 6, 8,
Oh, yeah.
10, 12, 14,
Did you
16,
all like?
18. It's kind of small. It's kind of small. So more people should show up, but in just a second, let's start making announcements. I was kind of hoping this was going to open.
I know everyone's like nutrition.
Now we're talking. Now we're talking.
I hope so. I do this too. And that's all I
Hey, yeah, that's right.
What is it? Yeah.
All right, so I'll start gently. More of your classmates will be arriving. Here's one now. Thanks for turning out the rain. I get that puts like an extra step in the getting organized. I feel a little better about the course in terms of I have a meeting with the contractor, and we're going to try to arrange for quiet times during your lab experiences. I think the good news is no matter what, we need to be a little flexible about the lab in terms of what will happen, because it's just a little confusing to me also, but I'm pretty sure we're going to pull it off, and by the end of this month, so once you've gotten through your first 2 labs and your first 2 discussions, Pauhana. There's no more work in there, and we will have a place to ourselves as we should have. So it looks very hopeful. In preparation for your lab, whether it's Monday or Wednesday, you want to read Lab 1 that I've posted on the campus website. You also want to read the American Heart Association Guidelines for Blood Pressure. It's only 8 pages, this thing. With particular focus on the how. How do you measure it properly? Then, because in our Monday or our lab this next week, we're going to talk a lot about gathering health history. There's a health history for you to complete about yourself, and we're serious, and we're going to keep it hidden from your fellow students, but we're going to do real exercising tests here. I need to know. So there's a health history and a waiver about lab liability that you're saying, you realize the lab entails some risks. You could fall down, you could get your hand caught in a door, and whatever other, for you guys, those are higher risks, and exercise is a pretty minor risk to you guys. But there's a waiver to sign. And then finally, for those of you who are enjoying or get stuff out of the text, read Mormon and Keller. Oh, and that reminds me, chapter 1, that several people, Kelly and a few others, found online free access to the first 2 chapters of Mormon and Keller. So if you go into the lab, somewhere in the canvas, in the files, it says links. I think it says links, and I posted the 2 links for the different texts. You can get to the American College of Sports Medicine Guidelines, which is our primary text, and you can get at least the first 2 chapters of Mormon and Keller. So it gets you jump started. Okay? Another thing for us to think about before we get into our details of our lecture is I'm probably not going to offer office hours this week. Let's have our first lecture. And I'm going to spend all day in boots in the lab. I'm going to be a mover and a fixer and a cleaner. So next week I'm willing to start office hours. And so I just want you to start thinking about, I realize that these don't have to be connected. It could be Monday 10 to 11 and Wednesday 10 to 11. But that excludes people. How many people have class right after this? Okay. Then I kind of like it. I think that's why I set this up is, Monday, have a big swath because you're coming back from a weekend and you've probably reviewed last week's lectures. And then on Fridays, maybe something a little later to get you guys out. Are you done by 11? Or we could do something I'm not super excited about 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday, but if it gets things done, okay. So think about this in terms of your lives, because your schedules are still kind of gelatinizing to gelling. True? Okay, so you think about that, and I'll probably take a hand vote next time I see you. So again, we're going to start. Are there any questions about the course? How many people introduced themselves? Anyone else new today who wasn't here before? Okay, so I need to get you signed up for the Canvas. Have you registered as a regular student?
Yeah, I'm registered. So I did a house thing.
Excellent. So be sure to go back and look at Monday stuff is like, contractual. The rules of the game, how many exams are there, stuff.
Okay.
Safety rules. Tell me your name. Quincy. Cool. Oh, you're Quincy. Good. So we're about to start our review, and I'm not going to, 1, 2, 3. You have had all this material in MPB 110C, or NESP 101, or MPB 113, or a combination of those. So I am going to go a little fast on these. I'll slow down when we get to things that are new or interesting. And then I'll slow down for these things because we're moving off of the stuff you covered at the lower level and starting to get into more complex stuff. So we're going to start today with an overview of why do we have cardiovascular systems. That's a really good place. I'll just ask a question here. You don't have to have a cardiovascular system to be a useful animal. Jellyfish don't have cardiovascular systems. Planarial worms, like the elements, don't have cardiovascular systems. The Anacarian fauna, most of us think that most ancient of multicellular life didn't have cardiovascular system. Anyone guess what those things, if you don't need a cardiovascular system, what do those things have in common that I've just described? Say a little. Oh, they don't have high rates of metabolism, right? They have low rates of metabolism. What about their structure? They tend to be big flat sheets where the world is right next door, right? You do everything by diffusion. So lots of surface area, low metabolism. So right away that starts to tell you, just flip that around and do the converse of it. So what attributes cause you to need a cardiovascular system? So being big, meaning a lower surface area to mass ratio, combined with a high metabolic rate, right? And so all large multicellular animals have a cardiovascular system. Even plants have a form of cardiovascular system because they have that same problem. They have a low metabolism, but they have a big bulky structure they need to transport. So good for you. Next big question. So cardiovascular systems appear to be for transporting material when diffusional distances or the rates of metabolism are too great. All right, so a quick question. That's a car. That's a Sequoia gigantea. It's a fairly large structure. Pop quiz. Where did the biomass come from? And I'm going to help you just a little bit. So remember, trees, they use a funny sort of structural sugar called cellulose. There's a huge amount of it. And then there's lignans and some other special parts. And of course, there's some water in them. So where does most of the carbon biomass come from? Isn't that crazy? Something this big, Quincy has said the air, something this large has extracted all that molecule by molecule of taking CO2s out of the air, cleaving them together with photosynthetic energy, shedding oxygen as a byproduct, thank you very much. And that's where the vast majority, there's a really interesting study that some of you are going to say the soil. The soil is where trees get their electrolytes and minerals. Really interesting study done back in the 1700s when this was still under discussion, where someone grew a tree up to about 20, 30 feet, and they planted it in a closed system. And afterwards, they weighed the soil beforehand, dry, and then they weighed the soil after. And the 30-foot tree that weighed well over 500 pounds had used about 3 pounds of soil. And the rest was all synthesized from the air. Totally cool. Good for you. So, question 2. I believe, from what I can tell, this is a after picture. Oh, so before we don't have it. Apparently before, she filled these pants. And now she's happy because she's after. Where did the biomass, presuming it wasn't a liposuction wand, where did the biomass go? Are you with me about it? When you consume fewer calories than you need in daily energy expenditure for days and weeks and months on end, your body will tap into its stored fuel sources, which are fat and protein. If you're not exercising, you'll tap into the protein as well. And use the molecules stored on your body. And then how does the weight leave? How does the carbon leave? CO2. Exhale into the air, which is kind of a crazy way to think about it, but it's true. You do. All right. And so what we've just said in sort of a long and drawn out way is that an important reason to have cellular respiration is to provide the substrates needed for energy metabolism. This is for the synthesis of cellulose, sugars, things. Oxygen is a byproduct in animal cells. Oxygen, glucose, starch, protein are imported, and we export carbon dioxide and water as our waste. The problem is, in humans, we're rather large animals. Our surface area to mass ratio is quite small. You have 5 trillion cells in your body, and what really makes it worse, so here's a person exercising. The exercising person, their kidney is not doing anything more than it did at rest. The kidney's metabolic change during exercise hasn't changed at all. The muscles metabolic need may have gone up by 20-fold. And so one of the real problems of cardiovascular systems is different groups of cells may have radically different levels. And this is conservative. You could easily, in an exercising muscle, have 20 times the resting energy consumption. And so the amount of oxygen that needs to arrive and the amount of CO2 and heat that needs to be hauled away goes way up. All right? So this is basically what we've said. The reason for having a circulatory system is to deliver substrate, nutrients, and to remove the wastes from activity. We have two circuits. The first circuit is is called the pulmonary circulation. It runs from the right heart, venous blood coming in here from the systemic. We go through the lungs. That's the pulmonary circulation. We're not going to talk about much in this class. And then here's the business end of the systemic circulation, the left heart pumping blood out to the periphery. And here's these cells. Your book, your Mormon and Heller says something about. Let's see if I can find that note. I can't find it, but Mormon and Heller says that most cells in the body are within 10 microns of a capillary, which is that's the size of a red blood cell. So a red blood cell would fill this capillary, and then an equal distance away is the cell. That's got to be an average, because corneas and cartilage are different, tendons are different. But for most of the cells in the body, that's true. So, okay. Remember that getting, say, oxygen to diffuse out of the capillary into the cell, or getting the CO2 waste to then move across this interstitial space, goo, by diffusion. Remember, diffusion is really slow as you go much beyond a millimeter in distance. It becomes impossible. That's why there's so few single-celled organisms that exceed 1 millimeter. That's a huge single-celled organism because you run into issues in transport. So diffusion works down here. Okay. The way that you would maximize diffusion then between the circulatory system and the cells that are being serviced, which we live in these little vacuoles. Thinness, so a thin membrane. Membranes slow diffusion. So having the capillaries be one cell thick, one endothelial cell thick, enhances diffusion. Having what I just said, the capillary is very close to the cell, so the diffusional distance is roughly 10 microns. Well, that's tremendously helpful for having a timely delivery of nutrients. And here's a picture of a true capillary. And see how the little red blood cells have all politely lined up, and they're kind of going through like a line of penguins inside here. And they are only separated from this muscle cell and that mitochondria by the cell membrane, the sarcolemma of the muscle cell, and the endothelial cell of the capillary. So pretty much right there. Is that all okay? All review, all cool pictures. Good. So this is Fick's law of diffusion, where the rate of transport of stuff X. Don't panic about this. It's actually amazingly straightforward. That diffusion is always based on a gradient, a delta X, a concentration gradient. If you want CO2 to move into the capillary, there better be less CO2 in the capillary than there is in the cell. You want oxygen to be moving into the cell, you better have more of it in the capillary than in the cell. So all diffusion is based on gradients, partial pressure gradients. And then these other things are things we just talked about. Surface area, diffusional distance, and that would include membrane thickness in this, that if the distance you're diffusing over or the thickness or number of membranes go up, that's inversely proportional to how quickly you can diffuse. So you want the least number of membranes of the thinnest possible nature. Does that all make sense? So that's diffusion. The way that capillaries are laid out, by having so many billions of them, you both increase the surface area of capillaries for diffusional exchange, and you also minimize, we just said that the average distance here is maybe 4 cell membranes. Actually, you only have to go through 2 of them. 2 cell membranes to go through, and 10 microns of distance. All sound familiar? Okay. I like this picture because notice they drew the arteries, they drew the arterioles, and then the person who made the figure suddenly realized if they tried to draw the capillary volume, it would like come off the page in both directions for 8 miles. So you there's a whole bunch of them. This reminds you that the capillaries are small. I would have made that 8 microns because or 8 micrometer because that's how big a red blood cell is. The wall thickness is 1 micrometer, and there's just a whole bunch of them. Notice that if you talk about the total cross-sectional area, the greatest width, if you want to think of it as a river, if you think of the cardiovascular system as a river, the greatest oxbow lake is the capillaries. What does that mean about speed of flow? It's got to be the slowest. And rivers, when they go into a rocky channel, they go hella fast because you can't compress water, and so the same total amount of water has to go through that little choke point as everywhere else in the river. You get to the wide, 6-inch deep sandbar, boy, it slows down like crazy, and that's what I've just showed you here. You knew this already. Mean linear velocity, so this is speed of blood movement, total cross-sectional area. So in the aorta and the vena cava, you go pretty fast. When you get to the capillaries, because there's such a massive amount of area, speed of flow drop. Why is that a good thing? Once again, it's all about diffusion. By slowing the flow to almost nothing, it creates time for exchange. The oxygen can leave the capillary, the CO2 can move into it because of this delay. And what tickles me is then once you get past the diffusional vessels, speed picks up again. It's like, it's a waste of time doing slow there. Let's tighten fewer vessels, restore speed over turn. All make sense? Okay. So mostly I've just talked about the diffusional end of the cardiovascular system. So what's the point of having a heart? And to cut to the chase, what the heart does, so if down here is the diffusional place, and it's all about thinness, nearbyness, concentration gradients, right? The only way then to hasten, once this diffusional thing is done, will giddy up, get the blood back to the central circulation, and pump it to the next circulatory bed, the capillaries of the lung, to restore the gas levels. And then here, so this part, the heart, is all about bulk flow. It's all about blood flow. And what the heart is doing is it is empowering the blood with pressure, is the best way to say it. We always focus on it like it's a forward pump. Remember, each beat of the heart is only putting out about 7% at most of the blood volume. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. The most important thing about what the blood has done to the little bolus that it ejects at the end of each second is the blood here is at 100 millimeters of mercury. The blood down here is at 20 millimeters of mercury. So which way the blood goes? It creates the gradient of transmural pressure that creates flow. All familiar, right? Good. So bulk flow happens here Diffusion occurs here. By the way, notice there's interactions here. If there's a high rate of metabolism in these cells, they are destroying the diffusional gradient, let's say oxygen, you're just thinking about it. If within half a second, the cells have consumed most of the oxygen out of the interstitial space and capillary, your diffusion slows down. What's the best thing to do? Sweep it away and add more blood. Bring in more arterial blood. So the rate of flow actually tends to assist in the maintenance of the diffusional gradient by bringing in fresh stuff and sweeping away the stuff that's been undergoing diffusion for more than a half second. Oh, I like that. How can I not be tired of this 30 years, 40 years later? I'm not. It's fascinating. Delighted. Good. So now we're going to tie these two ends together. Bulk flow of blood powered by the heart and diffusional function. So let's first talk about oxygen delivery. I kind of like the term presentation, meaning blood arrives, hemoglobin's arrive. I think of it as a waiter with hors d'oeuvres at a cocktail party. You want some oxygen? Right? And so delivery or presentation is a function of the blood flow rate, so the cardiac output, and the concentration of the concentration of oxygen within the blood. Does that make sense? Now remember that, so this would be an equivalent of, if you think about it, the number of waiters leaving the kitchen per minute can be thought of as cardiac output. And then the number of hors d'oeuvres on each tray can be a density measure. So you can think of that as the arterial content of oxygen. If the number of waiters leaving the kitchen and they're carrying these trays, is that enough to know how many hors d'oeuvres to be making? You know, how many hors d'oeuvres are going to disappear? Now, all this is how many hors d'oeuvres are presented. What step has to happen for hors d'oeuvres to disappear off of the tray? The audience, the people who are present, need to be hungry and remove one. That's tissue extraction. And so that's what's happening down at this level, is use is creating the actual extraction. So you can leave this slide, it's not nearly as important as this slide, because this side puts the two things together. Here is delivery, which is the cardiac output times the arterial oxygen concentration. Notice that we've captured the idea of extraction by saying, well, if we measure the number of hors d'oeuvres in the arteries, and then we count the number of hors d'oeuvres left on the trays as they come back to the kitchen, we know how much the crowd is extracting. This is often called tissue extraction. Gives you a sense of the metabolic hunger of the tissues. And if you have that extraction times that cardiac output, you can directly get the transport, and that can be either in or out. So oxygen consumption is a function of the cardiac output times the arterial venous difference in oxygen. Is that all pretty okay with you guys? Right? So the ways we do not usually change the arterial content of oxygen, humans do not do that. It's already maximized. We keep it maximum even at rest. And so what we do is, if we want to deliver more oxygen, you do more pumping of blood forward, and then the mitochondrial activity in the cells creates a greater diffusion gradient for extraction. Is that all okay? Now you're all wondering, why do they have 110C? You just did it half an hour. At least the cardiovascular. Any questions up to this point? All right, you okay? Mostly? As soon as you get your drink over. So I just want to point out a few things, since this is a class about heart function, cardiology, medical related stuff. You often would like to know, you can put a mask on the patient's face and measure their oxygen consumption, right? How much oxygen disappears out of their breathing region. A very interesting thing about this is you could rearrange this for blood flow. You could say, well, the total blood flow in the system must be the oxygen consumption. divided by the arterial venous difference of oxygen. So, cardiac output is a hard value to get without doing the Aztec thing and removing the patient's heart, and that is like a one-stop measurement. You get in trouble. So, how cool that if you were able to measure oxygen consumption at the mouth, do an arterial stick for oxygen content, and do a venous stick from a major deep vessel, you can know cardiac output. And that kind of measurement is done in ICUs all the time. We've even simplified it further. I won't show you the gaseous version, but you can do heat transport, or if you have indwelling catheters that give you these values, it's absolutely automated. So you can have online cardiac output up on the chart while you're walking around. Is that okay? And this is truly used, and I actually gave you an example here. I'll let you do the calculation. It's actually it's easier to use carbon dioxide production because carbon dioxide is produced inside, and it's a huge difference compared to atmospheric. Arterial oxygen is remarkably constant at 40 millimeters of mercury, or 5 mils of CO2 per 100 mils of blood. And so you play with this. Just see if you can get a cardiac output simply by knowing the CO2 production and the arterial venous difference. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm satisfied. We're not done. So to summarize everything I've said so far, cardiovascular systems really only have two working parts. They have a cellular level diffusional thing. And this is based on minimal distances, capillaries close to cells, thinness of membranes, and huge amounts of area, because those you could actually just write the diffusion equation up here and figure out why these are important to maximize rates of diffusion. Then fluid pumping is useful, but once you've done your diffusing, it's best to sweep that stuff away and replace it with fresh stuff that has good gradients. And then get the used blood back to the other capillary interface, which is up in the lung, to release the CO2 the cells have added. Does this all make sense? So cardiovascular systems are really a way for a cell that's deep, deep inside. It's surrounded by other cells, like a hepatocyte deep in the liver. The cardiovascular system basically makes it as though that hepatocyte was sitting in a petri dish exposed to the air, with all the stuff it needs handed to it. Right? It brings it enhances its exchange with the environment to a speed that matches its metabolism. And this is why you guys have heard this term before, facilitated diffusion. Remember what that means. Diffusion is what's happening down at the capillary interfaces. The facilitation has to do with pumping fluids. You could be pumping a gaseous fluid called air in and out of your lung. That's a pulmonary facilitation. Or you could be pumping a liquid fluid called blood around your system, and that's the cardiovascular facilitation. Is that right? All right. So, okay. To kind of finish, we'll talk more about this issue next time, which is I'm basically reminding you of Poissier's law, which is that the flow through a tube depends on the difference in pressure, the pressure gradient entering, pressure, back pressure down here, and then the resistance to flow. And the resistance to flow, so the more resistance to flow, the less flow, an inverse relation. Well, the resistance to flow is what Poissier, let's see if I have it. There's Poissier's figuring out of all the things that influence vascular resistance, a huge number of which don't change very much. Pi doesn't change, it's constant. N is the length, I believe, of the system, or L is the length of the system. Your cardiovascular system doesn't stretch it. So 8 is 8. What changes is the radius. So the radius is the huge determiner of forward flow, resistance to forward flow. And because of this r to the 4th power, I just want to remind you, it means that if a radius in an artery changes by 15%, if this little puppy opens by 15%, that doubles flow. For the same pressure head, it doubles flow. If it constricts by 15%, it cuts flow in half. So if you have a situation where these two arteries have the same resistance, and this one dilates by 30%, you now have 4 times as much flow going to this capillary bed as that capillary bed. And that is the absolute secret of how you get differential flow. Remember I said the great problem is different cell populations may have totally different metabolic needs. Why on earth would you want to flush your kidney with 4 times the amount of blood it actually needs? Well, this is how we do it. We control constriction or dilation of the arterioles to deliver the blood to the cell beds with the highest metabolic need. Does that make sense? You've heard that. Anyone who took MPB 113? Am I sounding familiar? I'm channeling Batista. Come on now, people. He seems to say, come on now, people, quite a bit. Come on now, people. I can't do a very good Batista imitation. So, because of this resistance controlling, here's the smooth muscles in the precapillary sphincter and the arteriole. These are changing. And wouldn't you guess, there's a bunch of things that control these, and that's part of what they learned in MPB 113. But it turns out one of the major controllers of vasoconstriction, the brain tends to, whenever we get in trouble, just closes circulation down. And then the metabolic byproducts of the tissue it feeds are dilators. So for instance, in the lung, the pulmonary circulation, oxygen is a tremendous dilator. Where would you like the blood to flow in a lung? Where the oxygen is, right? In a muscle, the byproducts of contraction tend to signal these smooth muscle cells to relax. And so it is the hardest working muscle that receives the most blood. It's just so cool. Tell me your name again in the back. You took 110C in some ways. They talk about this a little bit?
A little bit.
A little bit. That's why I was kind of filling in the reaction. So I'd like you to think, let's see, I got one more concept, and how are we on time? Fantastic. You may not have thought about this, but remember what happens to the pressure. Oh, nice picture. If the blood is coming into this arteriole, and you have a high level of constriction here, right? First off, you're going to get less flow in the capillaries, right? The thing you may not have thought of is, tell me about the capillary pressure if this is closed down. Now, the post-restrictive pressure, it's almost as though the resistance to flow is actually removing the pressure energy from the blood. And so the blood that does get in here is very low pressure. Does that make sense? If you dilate here, what does that mean about the pressure reaching the capillary bed? If you dilate it widely, you have not resisted away as much of the pressure as the heart put into it. And so you're going to get a much higher pressure perfusion of capillaries. Tell me, what do you think happens? Remember, capillaries leak. It's what they do. It is their very nature to leak. What do you suppose happens to fluid efflux if you widely dilate a capillary bed? Yeah, a lot of fluid leaks out. And so that's what we're talking about as the last concept. This is showing you the blood pressure. This is first the pressure effect. The pressure effect. At the level of the arteries, arterioles, and capillaries, it's showing you the thought experiment we just did. If the arterioles are highly constricted, they drop out more of the pressure energy that was put in by the heart, and you have a lower pressure flowing through the capillaries, right? The same, the converse is true. If the arterioles are widely dilated, more of the pressure put in by the heart actually makes it to the level of the capillary. I think we'll have time. Did you guys, so in other words, widely dilated people will tend to have more fluid filtration out of the circulatory system. Constricted cells tend to reabsorb. Constricted capillary beds. Do they discuss the Starling-Landis or the Starling capillary equilibrium with you guys in 110C? Because I asked this question, and it appears to be up to the instructor. So half of you arrive having heard of it. And if you want to know about fluid movement from the capillary into the interstitial space and back, there's 4 factors. These are the amount of pressure inside the capillary, the osmotic force of proteins, that's often called oncotic. You could also call it the colloidal pressure. Those are all synonyms. The suck, the protein suck of osmosis to pull fluid back in is opposite of the capillary hydrostatic pressure. And then out in the periphery has a very, the juice between the cells is a very low pressure. It's about 4 millimeters of mercury. And then there's collagen out here that has a protein draw. In the normal situation, this is really interesting. You arrive with a capillary pressure at the front part of the capillary at 35 or 30, and when you calculate these out, there's a large net efflux of fluid out the capillary when it arrives. By squirting all of its juice out, it destroys its own pressure, so that by the time it gets to the venous side, it is very low in pressure, and then if you add up the oncotic pull back in, plus the interstitial push, which they don't have on here, you actually get net resorption. So in a normal system, water exudes out as it arrives and then moves back in. Does everyone see why that might be useful? Heat, dissolved solutes, gases. This is actually a way to further speed the rates of transport. Now, the reason I bothered you about this, and I do have, this is great, but I will never go this fast again, and we've actually covered this. In a normal system, and I think you can figure this out, in a normal system, if you calculate it out based on the Starling lambdas, we actually filter rather more fluid per day than we reabsorb. And yet, my limbs are not swelling up like balloons. Remember, this is only the cardiovascular system. So what other way do we have to get fluid back? And this is the way they've drawn this is wrong. If you actually do the math, you come up short by about 2 liters per day of fluid. And of course, what you just told me is that fluid, that residual fluid, is taken up into the lymphatics, which are flabby valve things driven by movement, and the lymphatics cover that extra. So, my last point would be, if you look at this exchange, one way to have a whole lot of edema, build up of fluid in a limb, would be if you had an extraordinarily high pressure at this end. So a massive arterioulnar dilation. That would be, let's see, someone who had bacterial endotoxins, which were paralyzing their arterioles. Furthermore, the bacterial endotoxins also make the capillaries hyperpermeable, and so you have a double whammy, more pressure hitting the capillary beds and more permeability. So that would cause someone to blow up like a balloon. That would happen all over their body. The far more common way that people develop edema is, you could have a high back pressure. You know, if the heart was not able to pump away all the blood that returned to it, fluid would start to back up in the vena cava. You start to get a back pressure that was high here, and that would favor efflux. That's probably the most common reason that people get edema, is they have congestive heart failure. Their hearts are not powerful enough to pump away the blood that's been returned, and so blood gets peripheralized. Fluid gets peripheralized. Finally, as a way of ending, just again, I told you we're going to think like physicians in this course. Let's say someone developed edema, but in only one limb. This limb. Repeatedly getting swollen. That can't be a function of whole body hemodynamics. dynamics. Would anyone like to make a guess of what might be happening to someone who can't empty a limb? Lymphatic blockage. So when one sees a unilateral limb swelling, you immediately worry about cancer or infection in the lymphatic tree. If any of your moms have had breast cancer, if it's an advanced stage, we remove the breast, but then we also take the lymph nodes out of the armpit, the normal drainage, to be sure it hasn't spread. Well, in the taking of those nodes, if you remove 12 lymph nodes, you may impair the drainage. And so if anyone has a mom who complains of her arm being stiff at the end of the day and she wears a sleeve, compressive sleeve like the basketball players, and then has her arm elevated in the evening or in bed, that's exactly what happened. She had her lymphatic return was impaired by the surgery. Is this all making sense? Someone was talking about the global health major or global health class. In other countries, notice, no edema here. Well, mostly the edema is here. Huge edema. This is a case of filarial parasites. So there are worms, filarial worms. This is in Africa, great problem. The filarial worms really like the low pressure, nutrient-rich environment of the lymphatics. They infest the lymphatics and choke them closed. And this disease is called elephantiasis because the leg starts to take on this huge cylindrical pod-like foot like an elephant has. So that's an example of an infectious cause of impaired circulation leading to edema, extravasation. All make sense? Anyone ever wonder why giraffes don't get swollen ankles? They certainly have a ginormous pressure head. And it has to do, as you guys will learn in anatomy, for those of you who are taking anatomy this quarter, it has to do with the fascial wrapping, the internal support hose that surrounds the muscles. So if you have a nice hard fascia of connective tissue that encases each muscle, every time that muscle flexes, it pressurizes and drives blood out in the venous tree and also drives blood into the lymphatics, enhancing venous return. So giraffes wear support hose, it's under their skin. Does that all make sense? I had no idea we'd get this far. So by way of you guys leaving, I want you to think about, has anyone ever gone to the weightlifting place and you lift the weights, you come back into the locker room, you look at the mirror, and, oh my. It's like it's really quite visible, right? Then you go, well, that was fast. One workout, cool. Based on what we've just been talking about, I want you to think about that's called, there's no scientific word for that engorgement of muscle after a workout. Arnie Schwarzenegger and most bodybuilders call it the pump. The pump. I want you to think a little bit about what must be happening in those muscles that have been activated that is creating that appearance of congestion and fullness. And that's where we'll start next time. It's okay? Very good. Amy and Sahi, let's figure out our calendar thing for Friday right now, since I had to go. You guys do those homeworks, and by the time Monday comes, life will be better. That's right. I knew it was wrong. I just didn't have to be available. After 3. I saw what I saw. So and that allows me now to tell the subject when you come and try to accomplish this. Sometimes older people have more fun. So we'll examine doctors. We'd like to examine his head if we're not home. Yes, I saw your concerns and it's so well explained. So, next time I'll show you what you've done. But they are not violating. I said, yes, they are not violated. As soon as they simply